about interacting with the future, evidence for consciousness extending outside of space-time. So, all yours, Dale.
Okay, well, thank you. Is this turned on? Can you all hear? Okay, fine, wonderful. Okay, well, good afternoon, and I'm ready to dive into the future. I hope you are too. So I want to begin by just making a little bit of a qualifying remark. If you look at the bottom left side of my slide, it's very clear, photos by permission of Associated Press. So I do have approval to use their photos in this presentation. Now, when I went through the approval cycle, they did ask a question. Wasn't sure how to answer it. And they said, what is the name of your project? I didn't think I wanted to say it was for going outside of space-time. So I chose a word that I'm sure they really understood real well. I said, it's for retrocausation. No problem. I first became interested in time from a research and experiential point of view when I came across this book in the mid-'70s. Now, I had a series, or a long history, of spontaneous precognitive dreams all my life. But here was a case in this book written by John Dunn back in the early 1900s, 1920. It was published in 1927. An aeronautical engineer, one of the leading aeros of England at the time, and I had a special affinity for his life work because my background is also aeronautical engineering until I transitioned to the other realm. Now, John Dunn, in many of his spontaneous dreams, would dream, for example, of a fire in France, in Paris, and then read about it in a newspaper about 2 or 3 days later. He also dreamed about a volcano exploding in the Caribbean. I think that was Mount Paley, and he had pretty good accuracy of that one too, several days before he learned about it in the newspaper, in addition to other incidents, having to railroad accidents, personal experiences, and whatever. So I was really attracted toward his work. I didn't have an opportunity to really take a look at the field from other than a personal, spontaneous point of view until about 10 years ago when I set aside time to really, can I or anyone that I work with or know about experience the headlines of a newspaper or photographs that might be put in a newspaper several days ahead in time. So I did that and had the first work published in the Journal of this Society about 7 years ago. Now, I want to go into recent work. Now, what I'm doing recently, and this goes back about 1.5 years now, what I've chosen to do is focus on a very specific place in a local newspaper. And that specific place has a title, Around the World. There's only one picture in it. It has diverse content and a consistent schedule. So that looked like a good target to go for. The target being, describe that photograph that will be at that page, at that position in the newspaper. And the advantage of this is that it's 7 days in the future. Now that precludes an existing target pool. The event has not yet happened. It's in the future. The event usually occurs a day before it's published in the newspaper. So I thought that would be a very good illustration of spontaneous precognition. Because most of the time, those of us that have spontaneous experiences, it's hard, people don't believe them, we don't document them well enough, but here's a way of controlling it. The fact that they don't exist at the time of the sessions. And the colleague I worked with in Florida was quite proficient at remote viewing and also dream work. And my specialty is actually dream work, although I also do remote viewing at times. Now, I want to go into, backtrack just 2 examples of one of the earlier versions of this experimental project going into the future news. This was for only 3 days. And this was a sketch that my colleague made, and some words that you can see that describe the picture that she was perceiving in her remote viewing session. And as you can see, the sketch and the colors and the description are fairly close matches to that picture. Even though there's a lot of girls in there, only one is sufficient, really, to identify that there was a hit here. And in doing the statistics on it, the judges had no trouble choosing this from an alternative picture. Here was one that I did. Now, the one I just showed you was a picture that was probably planned. The photographer knew he was going there. Now, here's a case where it's an accident. This bus crash occurred in Western India 3 days after the session. Or the accident actually happened 2 days after the session. In this particular case, there were 2 dreams that came in with the intention of desiring to dream about that picture 3 days in the future. One showed, the bottom one, these shapes and a lake, and the top one showed just a crowd. So it was, I think, a reasonably good correlation, and the judges had no trouble choosing this from a comparative alternative picture. Now, in this case, it was an accident. Nobody was planning this. So here was an example of 3 days ahead, we perceived an accident. Now I want to go to the current cycle. It started just about 1.5 years ago. And this was the first one that I did, looking 7 days ahead in time to that spot in the newspaper. This was kind of interesting. The shape and the figure you see in the bottom, the way this dream was presented, there's a table and there's a projector. And the projector projected on the wall several figures that were really unusual looking. They reminded me of zombies. And one of the figures walked out of the picture and came toward me. Now the dream is becoming lucid, and I'm now looking at the strange figure in the dream right in front of me. I'm lucid. Now, had I not realized that this was an experimental situation, it could have been kind of frightening. So this figure actually came out of the wall. It's a picture of a carnival in Brazil, and the figure I saw was rather grotesque looking, covered with all kinds of weird coils and shapes and strings and garbage. So that matches the picture. Now, here's an example which is fairly clean. The photograph 7 days later is quite structural, mostly linear shapes. And this was fairly easy to perceive in a dream, just looking at these structures. And they were fairly easy to remember afterwards. And this illustrates a point I found over the years. For those that do this kind of work, you might want to think about this for selecting target pools. Whenever there is a picture that you want your remote viewer or your psychic person to describe, it's a good idea to have all, if you're doing contrasting pictures, have one that's all linear and another one that's all nonlinear. Now, I found that whenever it's all linear, that's all you're going to get, all linear shapes. If it's all nonlinear, you'll get nonlinear primarily. So it doesn't matter what you call them. The judge will have no trouble deciding between linear and nonlinear. Now, in this one, moving ahead to another part of the series that was actually a few months later, this was a more difficult perception. Again, it's 7 days in the future. This was a photograph of a demonstration in Korea, South Korea. There were Buddhists that were demonstrating against nuclear energy. Now, what made this particular experience unique was in the dream context. In all the imagery that occurred in the dream, there was a very distinct theme of anti-nuclear sentiment. And the only way you can deduce that by looking at the picture is if you read the caption underneath the picture, which said very clearly this was a nuclear demonstration in South Korea, anti-nuclear. The other way you can deduce the meaning from this is if you can read Korean, which I can't. And there was, if you notice on the bottom corner of the sketch, an attempt to draw a language or something. I thought it was Chinese, but it was actually the Korean language. Now, on this one, illustrates again, the problem of nonlinear and confusing boundaries. And this is one of the difficulties I've seen over the years in doing ARV work and other kinds of side work with pictures. If you're not careful about the boundaries and the color contrast, that makes it very difficult for the viewer, the dreamer, and especially the judges. So the dream itself was presented in the context of a bird flying towards somebody who put up his hand and grabbed the bird to do something with it. So the context is off, but the forms and the shapes tend to converge even though they're not accurate. So if this were a contrasting picture, like in a binary method, and the other picture was only linear shapes, a judge shouldn't have too much trouble choosing this one, even though you might argue it's not a dog. On the other hand, you could argue it's a bird dog. So we sometimes want to push the limits of how we interpret stuff. But interpretation is really a big issue, and I've run into this ever since 1976 when I first became involved with remote viewing research. You can do a wonderful job in drawing and sketching, but if you want to go into some level of determining what it is you perceived, you're running into some difficulty, particularly if you want to get to be very specific on what the perception was presenting to you. One of the difficulties in the field in general is the interpretation of what you perceive. Now, this one here got me to thinking, and I should have done a lot of thinking long before I got to this point in my travels through the future. Here's my issue with this. The picture is 7 days ahead. The sketch is kind of partially there, but it's clear enough that a judge should be able to select this from an alternative. The dream presented people crossing a river. One person has something like a black hat on, although in the actual picture it's some kind of package. Another person was carrying a white something, I didn't name it, which is one of the figures in the foreground is doing that. These are migrants crossing a river in Mexico, between Mexico and Guatemala. Now, what got me to thinking about this is here is a picture that I don't see for 7 days. The event doesn't happen for 6 days. So here are people at that spot in the river. There's the river. There are the ripples in the river. I can imagine had there been a telephoto lens that the photographer used, he could have gone right down into the details and found that mosquito on that person's back. Now, this is 7 days ahead. Would the river and the ripple and the wind and the mosquito still be in the perception of the future? I think so. And when coming from an engineering background, I like to look at boundary conditions. Okay, so you go to the edge. All of a sudden, the world doesn't end. This is not a flat Earth. So if I go a little bit to the left of the picture, a little bit to the right, the river still goes on. There are other migrants to the right and to the left. Another photographer would have caught that. A panoramic view of 100 photographers would have presented the entire river stretch. 7 days in the future. So I'm beginning to wonder about time, and I should have done this a lot earlier in my life. What is the future? Where is it? I'm going to claiming perfect accuracy with this, but to illustrate a point, if this can be done by myself or anyone, what does that tell us about the future? Fate and free will, where is it in this picture of the universe that we have? Well, not all went well. The newspaper went to chapter 11, and it was probably going to be closing. So what we had to do was shift our focus, not just to that particular nice, defined picture on the around the world section, but where else can be obtained information in the newspaper. So what was then happening were pictures that we saw of local news. This was an accident that occurred near my hometown. So because we no longer can work on the fixed picture, I decided to shift the focus entirely to any event. So on February the 18th, 2019, the focus was to have a dream that presents a significant news event that will be published on February 24, a very specific day, 6 days in the future. So the dream happens, and I'm looking at an airplane flying over a low body of water, and the airplane crashes straight down into the bay. It looked like a bay. I thought it was a Boeing 737. So 6 days later, there is a crash in Trinity Bay. On that day, a Boeing 767 crashed. I had the wrong airplane. So I decided to ask my colleague in Florida to work on a similar kind of task 7 days ahead, March 3. What is a photograph that will be published in the World News section somewhere in the newspaper 1 week from now? So she describes a field that's barren with a tractor in it and people standing around. And it matches the crash site of the Boeing 737 that crashed in Ethiopia. She didn't perceive the airplane go down, but the crash site itself is a fingerprint of the future. It looks like we also had a perception of that tragedy. She also had one of a dam that burst 7 days ahead, and found that in the stream news that she looked at. Then I had one of a tremendous fire raging through a city, and that turned out to correlate with the Notre Dame fire. So what I have. So in looking over the future news and many future news projects I've done over the years, now we're going to see that there's something that might be interactive here, even though what I've shown you here were kind of fixed. I have other examples that are not in this talk where you can actually alter the future at a personal level. So I'm going to see, in my mind, a new way of looking at the future, new to me and maybe new to a lot of people. To think about the future as interactive, adjustable, probable, then it allows one to be more proactive with intuition. It has to do with future incidents, psi vigilance, being on alert. And I'm really interested right now in setting up precognitive dreams, and I'm probably going to be doing that in the local area too. There are other implications too about the universe. Is it holographic in nature? Is it non-local? I tend to think of non-locality in a different sense. I think of non-locality of non-locality, because if you're going beyond space-time, like I think we're happening in the future, this is not local anymore. This is beyond non-locality. It relates to consilience. And interacting with the future can be either accepting and perceiving a projection from something, collective unconscious universal mind sources, signal from something, retrocausation I like. The future doesn't have to, but it can influence the present and the past. And one of the best ways of seeing this in your own life is through synchronicity. Now you have an interactive process going on all the time with something in the future that you will be meeting up with. So I feel synchronicity and precognition are the same thing, it's just a different way of activating the result. Synchronicity, again, I see as a fundamental unifying principle. It's subconscious orchestrating. It selects and aligns future possibilities ahead of us. No matter how many trillions of out there, it zeroes in on the one or two that are meaningful to us. relates to retrocausation. And I'm a little surprised, and I haven't heard anything so far in the conference about the role of psi in evolution. How can it not have a role in evolution? And synchronicity is, I think, a key aspect of consilience. What am I going to do in the future? Okay, I'll stay with staying with a future event. I have to get away from a fixed picture and go with any significant event, 1 to 2 weeks in the future. But now that the goal is higher, I have to go for specific locations and causes. What caused the accident? Where is it? And it's only if we can do that can we begin to reconnect and maybe adjust and maybe prevent some of these catastrophes. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions.
Cool stuff, Dale. Sorry. So I guess just a kind of a pragmatic question when you're designing these studies. When the subject becomes associated with the experiment, I'm just kind of thinking about how some of these images, the drawings, seem to represent the scene more generally, and some seem to represent the target as a photograph, right? Like a field view versus an observer view of the scene.
Yes. Some of it you're in it, others you're watching it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's particularly the case with like the bird-dog displacement effect that seemed to kind of capture the photograph, not necessarily the content of the scene. So
Correct.
I was hoping you could speculate a little bit. Is there something about the design or the instructions or the person's interpretation or how their subconscious interprets the instructions that they're given? Or is there something specific about the targets that might pull one into more of a view of the image versus a view of the scene in the dream content?
I think the key is in the target picture itself. If you have blurred boundaries and color contrast that are not that great, you're going to smother yourself all over the place. You know, imagine yourself being in a flash picture. You just flash something up and back off. What will you remember of it? And what I do sometimes when I have some question about the validity of a target pull or how good it might be, I copy it in black and white to destroy the color contrast. Because a lot of my experience I've had in the past, remote viewers don't always perceive in black and white. In fact, many do initially. So if you look at it from a black and white perspective, now you begin to see the importance of boundary. In that picture with the bird dog, you can see everything was smeared together. There was no clear boundary. You really have to stop and look at it. And it took me a few minutes of studying it to really understand what it was. And then I had to read the caption to be sure. So it's a target, mainly.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
You were talking about possibly forming precognitive teams locally. Have you ever thought about expanding that to a global level, like having participants from all over?
I tried that in the year 2000, and I created a nice little acronym for it, IMPACT, International Precognitive Team, something like that. I forgot what it meant. And the problem I ran into, I got swamped. I couldn't handle the input. And this is when I was still on the weak side of the digital divide. I'm not that far ahead of it now. I just couldn't handle the data, so I quit. But by keeping it local, very few people that I personally can handle. Now, with computer work, you should be able to expand this and make it more universal.
Hey, Dale. So if you do this any significant event, 1 week in the future, 2 weeks in the future idea, so instead of pinpointing a time, just looking at any significant events, are you hearing me?
Could you repeat the question, York?
Yeah, so this idea of looking for any significant event 1 week or 2 weeks into the future rather than a specific time, this idea on that slide?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of going away from, I mean, it's going towards what people will call confirmation bias, right? So you'll go search for the so my concern is this, so my question is this. Yeah. Would you be willing to take the data that you already have and give it to someone.
Yeah.
And with, yeah.
In the previous work I did that. And that eventually became published somewhere. But
Okay,
I did
could you do that
with
again? Because I think before you go into this confirmation bias.
The confirmation bias can
land.
be eliminated if you get very specific. For example, I had that fire there. I usually don't show fires, and I do occasionally dream of fires. But having worked in sort of a dream work community for many years, many people dream of fires from a therapeutic point of view. They symbolize something like anger or something. So I look at that and say, no, it's not that. So I don't usually include that in my data, but this was so powerful I did. So I don't consider it valid, but if I would have had Notre Dame, that would be different.
Yeah, yeah.
So anytime in the future, if I'm going to be using any news, it has to be on that day, 7 days, 14 days. Okay, don't count. So right away, I'm eliminating a big source of criticism. The other is, how accurate is it? Is it Notre Dame? Is it Paris? Is it New York City? You know, if you get down to that detail, where's the confirmation bias? It goes away.
Okay, let's thank our speaker.
Where's the confirmation bias?